A 20-year-old orphan is forced to marry a billionaire's simple-minded son, only to discover the true danger lies with his powerful father. Night after night, the old man sneaks into her room, until his wife uncovers the betrayal, igniting a scandal that destroys them all. Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. Before we dive in deeper, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far our stories travel. If you're enjoying this suspenseful tale so far, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when a new story drops. More twists, more drama, and more shocking tales are on the way, so stay tuned. Alina sat quietly at the edge of the grand dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The chandelier above her glimmered like a crown of 1,000 diamonds, but the weight pressing on her chest reminded her she was no queen, only a pawn. At 20, she had already lived more lives than most women twice her age. Her parents had died when she was still a child. The world had not been kind since then. She learned to fend for herself, wandering from one relative's cold charity to another's reluctant care, until there was no one left willing to take her in. By the time she was 18, she was truly alone, an orphan with no dowry, no family name, and no future. Then came the Donovans. When the billionaire businessman, Mr. Donovan, extended a proposal through a distant acquaintance, Alina thought it was a miracle. A marriage into one of the wealthiest families in the city. Her days of hunger, of borrowed shelter, of fear and uncertainty were finally over. Or so she believed. Her husband-to-be, Adrian Donovan, was the only son of the empire's patriarch. The Donovans' fortune stretched across industries, hotels, banks, oil, even politics bent before their influence. Alina had entered their mansion like a bird offered a golden cage, dazzled by its wealth but unaware of its bars. The wedding had been private but lavish. Guests whispered admiration for Alina's beauty, her delicate features, her soft voice, the way she carried herself with grace despite her humble beginnings. But few noticed Adrian's vacant gaze, or the way his laughter rang too loudly, too childishly for a man of his age. Alina learned quickly what others had not said aloud. Adrian, though handsome, was not whole. His mind was stunted, forever locked in a child's world. He threw tantrums when meals were not to his liking. He clapped with glee at cartoon shows. At night, he would chatter endlessly about toys he once had, never truly understanding the vows he had spoken at the altar. For Alina, it was a cruel twist of fate. She was married, but not to a husband who could love, protect, or even understand her. Instead, she became more nurse than wife, smiling politely at family dinners, guiding Adrian through simple tasks, and hiding her despair behind practiced silence. Mr. Donovan, the patriarch, often watched her during these dinners. He spoke little, his presence alone enough to command obedience. His wife, regal and elegant, managed the household with cold efficiency, but it was the old man's eyes Alina felt most. There was something unsettling in the way they lingered too long, the way they softened when they met hers. On her wedding night, Alina had sat at the vanity in her silk gown, staring at her reflection. The diamonds around her neck glimmered like shackles. Somewhere deep inside, she realized the truth. She had not been saved, she had been bought. And in the mansion of the Donovans, everything had a price. The Donovan mansion was a palace of silence. Its marble floors gleamed, its chandeliers burned with a cold brilliance, and its long hallways seemed to stretch into endless shadows. For Alina, it was not a home but a stage, and every day she played the part of the dutiful bride. Her husband, Adrian, remained blissfully unaware of her inner turmoil. He was like a child in a man's body, laughing too loudly, tugging at her hand when he wanted to show her a new toy, sulking when things didn't go his way. At night, he fell asleep quickly, clutching his pillows like a boy clinging to his favorite blanket. Alina would lie beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had twisted into this strange prison. But what unsettled her most was not Adrian. It was his father. Mr. Donovan was a man carved from steel and shadow. At 65, his hair was silver, his frame still tall and commanding, his voice deep and deliberate. Business associates bowed before him. Politicians shook his hand with practiced smiles, and even the staff inside the mansion lowered their heads when he passed. He was the sun around which everyone revolved, burning, blinding, impossible to escape. And he watched her. Alina first noticed it during dinner. As Adrian babbled excitedly about a cartoon he had watched earlier, she felt the patriarch's eyes on her. Heavy, deliberate, unblinking. She shifted in her chair, but whenever she glanced up, his gaze was fixed. Not in a fatherly way. Not in a way that belonged to a man who had just welcomed a daughter-in-law into his home. It was different. It was dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and the stares continued. Sometimes they were subtle, hidden beneath the rim of his wine glass. Other times they were bold, a long, slow drag across her figure as though she were a possession, not a person. When he spoke to her, his words carried a weight of suggestion, though veiled beneath politeness. "You look well, Alina," he said one evening, his tone slow, deliberate. "Marriage suits you." She forced a smile, bowing her head. "Thank you, sir." "Sir." The word tasted like ash on her tongue. His wife sat across the table, sipping wine with regal detachment, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to notice, the unspoken tension that simmered beneath the chandelier's glow. Alina tried to convince herself it was her imagination, that perhaps the long stares were nothing more than curiosity, that his tone was nothing but formality. But in the quiet moments, when she walked through the halls and felt his gaze burning into her back, when he lingered too close as she poured tea, she knew. Mr. Donovan wanted something. And in that mansion, his will was law. Alina's nights grew longer, her sleep restless. She began to dread the sound of his footsteps, the echo of his voice. She was trapped between a husband who could not protect her and a father-in-law whose eyes promised a darkness she could not yet name. The walls of the Donovan mansion were closing in, and Alina knew the predator had begun to circle. The storm began just after midnight. Rain pounded against the Donovan mansion's tall windows, and thunder rolled over the hills like distant drums of war. Alina sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm. Beside her, Adrian was already asleep, snoring softly, his arms wrapped around a stuffed pillow he had carried since childhood. He looked peaceful, almost innocent, like a boy lost in a dream. Alina's heart, however, was far from peace. The mansion was too quiet, its silence too heavy. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind made her body tense. She had grown used to Mr. Donovan's stares, but something inside her warned that those eyes would not be content with watching forever. The clock struck 1. She heard it then, the soft creak of the door. Alina froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the door slowly pushed open. A shadow spilled across the floor, tall and unhurried. Her hands clutched the blanket tightly, her pulse racing. And then he was there. Mr. Donovan stood in the doorway, framed by the flicker of lightning. He was dressed in a silk robe, his silver hair glinting in the pale light. His face carried no shame, no hesitation, only calm authority, as if he belonged there. "Don't make a sound," he said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the storm. "You'll wake him." Alina's lips trembled. Please leave." But the billionaire stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. Each step toward her bed was deliberate, like a predator closing in on prey. Adrian stirred faintly in his sleep, but did not wake. "You are my son's wife," Mr. Donovan said, his tone low, almost a whisper. "But you are also under my roof. Do you understand what that means?" Alina shook her head violently, tears stinging her eyes. "This is wrong. He's your son." His mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "He doesn't know what marriage means. But I do." The storm outside howled louder as he reached the bed. Alina wanted to scream, to fight, but her voice choked in her throat. His hand gripped her wrist, firm, commanding, and she realized with horror that her words meant nothing. His wealth was power, his silence was shield, and she was trapped in a cage of both. Adrian snored softly, oblivious, as the man who should have protected their marriage tore it apart. When it was over, Mr. Donovan rose as though nothing had happened. He adjusted his robe, his expression calm, even satisfied. "Remember," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "you say nothing. No one will believe you. You are nothing without this family." And with that, he slipped out of the room as silently as he had entered, leaving Alina trembling in the darkness. The thunder rolled again, shaking the mansion, but the storm inside Alina was far greater. She lay beside her husband, tears streaming down her face, realizing the terrible truth. The billionaire had taken what he wanted, and he would come again. Morning light filtered through the tall curtains, casting golden streaks across the Donovan bedroom. Adrian awoke with a yawn, stretching like a child, then turned to Alina with a grin. "Did you sleep well?" he asked brightly. Alina forced a smile, her voice caught in her throat. "Yes, I did." It was a lie. She had not slept at all. Her body ached, her heart heavier than stone. She sat beside her husband, who remained blissfully unaware, and wondered if fate was mocking her. She was a bride in name only, a wife trapped in a nightmare she could never speak aloud. Days melted into each other, and so did the nights. The first intrusion had shattered her, but it was not the last. Mr. Donovan returned again and again, always at night, always when Adrian was asleep. His presence became as predictable as the ticking of the clock. A creak of the door, the weight of his shadow, the commanding whisper, "Don't wake him." Each time, Alina resisted less. Not because she consented, but because resistance was useless. His grip was iron, his power absolute. He was a man shielded by wealth and reputation, a man who had convinced himself that what he took was his by right. Alina's soul withered. She stopped looking at herself in the mirror. Her reflection was no longer her own. It was a stranger's, pale and hollow-eyed, dressed in silk and diamonds, but carrying shame like chains. She avoided Mrs. Donovan's gaze during meals, afraid the older woman might see the truth etched into her face. The staff noticed, though they said nothing. A maid once lingered too long as she poured tea, her eyes flicking from Alina to the patriarch, then quickly lowering again. Money sealed lips. Fear sealed the rest. Adrian remained oblivious. He would chatter happily about childish things, tugging her arm, begging her to play games or watch cartoons with him. Sometimes, in the middle of his laughter, Alina's eyes would fill with tears, and he would ask, confused, "Why are you sad?" How could she answer him? How could she explain the weight crushing her chest, the truth poisoning their marriage bed? Instead, she swallowed her grief, hiding it behind a smile, telling him she was just tired. Always tired. But inside, a storm brewed. Nights stretched into endless torment, and each time the billionaire left her room, Alina lay awake, clutching the sheets as if they could protect her. Shame burned through her veins, and guilt ate at her like acid. She was trapped in silence, unable to scream, unable to run. For the mansion was not just a home, it was a fortress. The Donovan name carried power too great to challenge. And Alina, the orphan bride, had no one to turn to. She lived each day as a ghost, her voice muted, her spirit fading. She was the perfect victim, unseen, unheard, forgotten. But deep down, she wondered, how long could she endure before something inside her broke? The Donovan mansion was a world of polished marble and hushed voices. The grandeur impressed visitors, but for those who lived within its walls, secrets pressed harder than the chandeliers hanging above them. The staff moved quietly about their duties, trained never to speak unless spoken to. Yet even silence has cracks, and within those cracks, whispers began to grow. They noticed the way Alina's eyes had dimmed since the wedding. They noticed how the master of the house lingered near her, his hand brushing too close when he passed a tray, his gaze resting far longer than a father-in-law's ever should. They noticed how she flinched sometimes, how she avoided corridors at night, how her laughter, so radiant on the day of her marriage, had died almost completely. But the staff said nothing. They depended on the Donovan fortune, and fortune came with rules. Money bought silence, silence bought survival. Alina felt the weight of those unsaid words pressing down on her. The mansion itself seemed to watch her, the golden frames on the walls reflecting her pain, the corridors echoing with footsteps that never led her to safety. Every night, Mr. Donovan returned. Every night, she shrank further into herself. She became two women, one for the daylight, smiling faintly, holding Adrian's hand as they walked the gardens, pretending to be the perfect bride, and one for the darkness, broken and trembling, her body used as if it were no more than another asset in the Donovan empire. She hated herself for the silence. She hated the way her lips refused to form the words she so desperately wanted to scream. But where would she go? Who would believe her? She was just a poor orphan girl plucked from obscurity. He was a billionaire, untouchable, the man who built half the city's towers. The thought of escape flickered in her mind. Sometimes she imagined running through the iron gates barefoot, vanishing into the night. But then she remembered the guards stationed at the estate, the bodyguards loyal to Mr. Donovan, and the world outside that knew her only as Mrs. Adrian Donovan. She could not vanish. The name bound her tighter than any chain. And yet, the shame was unbearable. One evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, she traced the diamonds around her neck. To outsiders, they sparkled as gifts of love. To her, they glittered like shackles. Her reflection stared back hollow-eyed. I am not a wife, she thought. Asterisk, I am his prisoner. His mistress of pain, asterisk. The door creaked, and her heart sank. His shadow filled the room again, his presence heavy, suffocating. She didn't move. She didn't resist. She simply turned her face away, tears burning her cheeks. Mr. Donovan leaned close, his voice low and smug. You're learning your place, Alina. That's good. That's very good. And with those words, her hope cracked a little more. She realized then, she was no longer Alina the orphan bride. She was Alina, the secret woman of the house, the mistress of the man who should have been her protector. Mrs. Donovan was not a woman who missed details. For decades, she had lived at her husband's side, watching him climb from ambitious businessman to billionaire kingpin. She had seen how he charmed investors, manipulated rivals, and bent rules until they snapped in his favor. She knew the man she had married, his arrogance, his appetites, his unquenchable thirst for control. She had tolerated much. The affairs with younger women in the city, the whispered scandals he buried with money, the late-night meetings that were never about business. She endured it all, wearing her crown of dignity like armor. What she never expected was to sense betrayal inside her own home, under her very roof. It began subtly. At dinners, she noticed the way Alina avoided her eyes, her smile thin, her shoulders tense whenever Mr. Donovan spoke. She noticed the faint tremor in Alina's hand as she passed the wine glass, the way her voice wavered whenever the patriarch's presence filled the room. Mrs. Donovan also noticed her husband. He had grown bolder since the wedding. His gaze lingered on the young bride too long, his words edged with a softness he never used on others. Once, she caught him brushing Alina's hand as he reached for a napkin. The moment was fleeting, but it struck her like a blade. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Perhaps she was imagining things. Perhaps her weary heart was inventing ghosts where there were none. But the signs kept piling up. She began to watch more closely. One night, as she passed down the corridor toward her chambers, she heard footsteps that did not belong. She paused, listening. Her husband's door opened. Instead of turning toward the study or the veranda, his shadow moved down the hall, toward Alina and Adrian's quarters. Her chest tightened. Mrs. Donovan did not follow that night. She returned to her bed in silence, her thoughts swirling like a storm. But the seed had been planted, and from that seed grew suspicion. Over the next few days, she observed with sharper eyes. Alina's sudden silences, her distant stares, the redness around her eyes in the mornings, signs of a woman burdened by something unspeakable. And her husband, always composed, walked with the smugness of a man keeping a dark secret. Mrs. Donovan had spent a lifetime in silence, playing the role of the dignified wife, but she was no fool. She knew when her husband was hiding something. He knocked, not with authority, but with the gentle tap of a man seeking permission for something forbidden. A moment later, the door opened, just a crack, and Alina stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling. Not tonight. But Mr. Donovan pushed his way inside, his hand brushing against her arm, silencing her protest. The door closed. Mrs. Donovan froze. Her chest constricted, her body trembling with a mix of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. For a moment, she considered turning back, retreating to her chambers, pretending none of this existed. But something inside her, something fierce and long buried, snapped. She stormed forward and pressed the door open with sudden force. The scene before her was damning. Her husband stood too close to Alina, his hands at her shoulders, his eyes alight with hunger. Alina's tears shimmered in the candlelight, her small frame stiff with terror. Charles. Mrs. Donovan's voice cracked like a whip. The old man turned, his face blanching for the first time in years. His lips parted, but no excuse could escape. Alina broke free, rushing to the corner, clutching a blanket around herself as if it were armor. For a heartbeat, silence consumed the room. 3 lives, entangled in betrayal, stared at one another in raw exposure. "You disgust me," Mrs. Donovan hissed, her chest heaving. "Your own son's wife?" Mr. Donovan's mask of power crumbled, his mouth working for words that wouldn't come. Alina sobbed softly, her secret finally dragged into the light. Mrs. Donovan's fury was no longer contained. She stepped closer, her fingers stabbing the air. "I should have known. You've ruined everything you touch. But this," her voice shook with venom, "this is unforgivable." From her robe, she produced a small flash drive, gleaming like a weapon. "Do you think you were clever, sneaking night after night? I had the cameras replaced. Every step you took, every time you entered her room, recorded. The board will see. The press will see. You will be finished." For the first time, Charles Donovan looked afraid. He lunged across the table, trying to snatch the drive, but Mrs. Donovan was quicker. She rose, her chair toppling, and hurled it toward Alina. The girl caught it, clutching it to her chest like salvation. "You wouldn't dare," he roared, spittle flying. "I would," Mrs. Donovan hissed. "You've humiliated me for the last time. And if the scandal doesn't bury you, I will." The room erupted. Charles's fury boiled over. He shoved the table aside, its contents crashing to the floor. Alina screamed, but Mrs. Donovan did not flinch. She stared at her husband with the cold finality of a woman who had already signed his death warrant. That night, news broke across every channel. Charles Donovan, disgraced billionaire, accused of unspeakable betrayal within his own family. His empire crumbled overnight, investors fleeing, partners severing ties. And in the mansion that once rang with wealth and arrogance, silence settled again, this time permanent. For Alina, the nightmare was over. For Mrs. Donovan, vengeance had finally been served. And for Charles Donovan, there was nothing left but ruin.